people just to keep your mic off unless you're obviously speaking and volunteering to speak. Please use the chat facility to share your ideas, and later on in the session we will have an interactive board as well. So I'll be asking for your contribution and your ideas later on in the session. So so kicking off our second session, it really continues the discussion we began in the Policy Lab 1 when we was exploring what are the kind of difficult or challenging places, people and participation approaches to engage in terms of doing policy making. And we had quite a rich discussion, and we had colleagues from Newham what joined and gave us examples of what they're doing, as well as contributions from in the cyber room as well. And when it came to people, the three, I guess, key groups where we found a challenge to engage were members of the LGBTQ+ community, young people, as well as older men. But the conversation didn't stop there. It finished on intersectionality. So it's how all these protected characteristics come together and make accessing and working with these particular demographics even more challenging. So that will be a thread we will be hopefully picking up later today. In terms of places, what was identified in the discussion was estates. So in terms of London, high-rise tower blocks. In terms of the rest of the country, we was talking about sprawling council estates and how they're very difficult to penetrate. Equally difficult or challenging was the very remote rural communities, care homes, as well as typical residential homes as well, where our residents obviously would live, as well as deprived communities. And so again, hopefully we'll pick up on some of those themes and threads in our discussion today. In terms of the weakest types of strategies or participation strategies, what we identified from the discussion, what came out top was resident survey. They offered very little when it came to engaging residents in policy making. One-off meetings was identified as a particular weakness, as well as the digital platforms we are all designing and offering. They were seen as problematic as well as the three top kind of issues. And so each of those streams we'll continue talking about today as we kind of change the focus of the discussion, looking more at the solutions. How do we get around some of these issues and potential problems? And to do that, we've got three presenters. And so I'll be sharing a bit of my work around engaging young people. We've got George and Toby from Waltham Forest, who will be sharing some of the strategies they've employed, and also Imogen, hopefully, who's on the call from Islington, who will also be sharing some of the strategies and approaches they've adopted. And so the workshop will kind of share those presentations, and then we've got a dedicated section at the end where will be a bit of a Q&A, and I'll also be asking you what strategies and approaches you've kind of employed and used as well to get around some of the challenges. Before I ask Noel just to speak about what this space and remind us all what this space is about, I just wanted to flag that the third workshop will be taking place this time next week. And the third workshop, we really will be focused on our capacity building. What skills do we need as policymakers, researchers or practitioners in the field to really enhance or up our game in terms of engaging residents? So if you've not registered, I'll kindly ask you to register, and I'll look to see you all again next week. At that point, I'm just going to hand over to Noel just to kind of remind us what this space is about.
Thanks, Darren. So, yeah, as a council, we've got a really strong commitment to how we involve residents in a variety of different activities that we do as a council, and that includes policy making. And as I think I mentioned kind of last week, there are a variety of ways that we do that, and you know, we had the example from Amy and Chris of community assemblies. We've also got citizens' assemblies and citizen scientists. Now, today we're not going to go through those examples, but we can share them at another point. But what what we want to do through this participation in policymaking lab series is really to identify how we can improve participation, in particular, for particular communities, going beyond the general population. And not just identifying the challenges, but developing the solutions. And like Darren said, the series will also focus on what are the skills that kind of policy makers need. How do we kind of scale some of this work up so it goes beyond kind of flagship programs. And the reason kind of we're involving you in this process is not just so that it can kind of broaden our horizon, but that we can learn together as a peer network. So this isn't just of something that is of use to Newham, but is of use to hopefully everyone on this call and other people that join, which is why it's really great to have examples from other councils here today who'll be presenting, and obviously hopefully yourselves pitching in ideas as well. So back to you, Dan.
Great, thank you, Noel, for that. And so I'll be starting my presentation, and I come from very much from a research perspective. So I am an academic, and so my role in terms of policy making has always been working with communities, with residents, in terms of shaping research, shaping, I guess, this finding from research to then go on to shape and influence the development of policy. So I'm just going to show you a brief animation, just really illustrating some of the work I've been doing with young people over the years. And so the audio, this is always a tricky part, so I'm turning the audio on, but please show me with your thumb, Noel, if you can hear it once I play it. Can you see that okay, Noel?
Yeah, can see it. Yeah, can see it
Okay.
now.
I'm going to extend it now and then play.
Cultivating young people's empowerment and participation in society. Young people are central to a country's growth and development as they bring fresh perspectives and innovation. However, the path towards gaining full inclusion in society can be arduous for many youths, particularly those from marginalised and disadvantaged backgrounds. In England, young people who are most active in political and economic life tend to be from higher socio-economic backgrounds. Ultimately, this leads to governments that are not representative of wider society. By including young people from diverse backgrounds in political life, the British government would create and implement more inclusive policies towards achieving social equity. Dr. Darren Sharp, a senior research fellow at University of East London's Institute for Connected Communities and Cape Policy Fellow at the University College London, has recently examined some of the challenges faced by young people in England on their path towards achieving full participation in society. In his recent paper, Dr. Sharp reflects on how youth services can help disadvantaged and socially excluded groups of young people overcome the obstacles that prevent them from becoming engaged citizens and from having a voice in local and national politics. Dr. Sharp's paper summarises the results of 4 studies involving young people between the ages of 15 and 21. One of these studies focused on the unemployment trap, which refers to the tendency of some young people to remain unemployed for long periods of time, relying on state benefits because there are no incentives to become economically independent. Many of the study's participants felt frustrated by the ways in which unemployed young people are portrayed in society. The negative perception of unemployed young people compounded their lack of self-confidence and self-worth, and formed a barrier to them finding meaningful employment and engaging with their community. This is where youth services could play an important role. By nurturing young people to increase their self-confidence and self-worth, such services could help youths to break out of the unemployment trap, putting them on the path to becoming engaged citizens. The second study focused on the challenges encountered by young people from Roma and traveller communities, including racism and bullying. These young people's involvement in the UK Youth Parliament facilitated their participation in society, while also allowing them to observe social issues associated with their communities from different perspectives. The third study highlighted the importance of actively giving young people a voice in local politics. This study, based in a disadvantaged urban area, revealed how older adults on a town council were unaware of many issues faced by local youths, including violence, drug misuse, and a lack of safe spaces to socialise. By giving a permanent voice to young people on the council's regeneration board, the local young people's feelings of dissatisfaction and alienation were transformed into tangible outcomes of recognition and respect. Finally, the fourth investigation explored factors that can encourage young people to be politically active, including participating in school councils and attending national student conferences. This work demonstrated that the shift from dependency to independence is a crucial step in young people's empowerment. Dr. Sharp offers valuable insight that could guide the development of new initiatives aimed at broadening the participation of young people in society. He also highlights the crucial role that youth services can play in ensuring that young people from all backgrounds are heard and politically engaged towards building a more prosperous and equitable future.
Excellent. So, if I can ask Imogen to upload your slides.
Do you mean, do you want me to share my screen, Darren?
Please, yes.
Okay, sure.
So if you don't mind just introducing yourself and which authority you're from, Imogen.
Sure. Hi, my name is Imogen. I work for Islington Council and I work in the Policy and Equality team in our Corporate Affairs Together Directorate. So I'm going to be presenting today on our big programme of public engagement into inequality that we've been running for the past 6 months. Can everyone see the slide? Can you see the slides okay? Okay, fab. Let me just share. Yeah, so I can't see anybody's face when I share the screen. So if there's anything that you want to ask a question on, just shout out so then I can hear you, and I'll just pause it. Okay, cool. So yeah, so just a quick whistle-stop tour to outline. So in the past sort of 9 months, we've been running a big programme of public engagement to try and understand local people's lived experiences of inequality with a view to developing a new strategic plan and delivery plan and new policies that are kind of really thinking about what a more equal future could look like in Islington. And there's 4 main components, including looking at kind of our existing data. We have a bit of a task force of experts, and we've also got a big piece around actually going out into the community and understanding people's lived experiences and talking to people and meeting people where they are in the community. And so that's the piece that I'll be focusing on today. Just a quick whistle-stop tour of what we've sort of done. So, for example, as I said, we go out a lot into the community where possible. So libraries, parks, gyms, community centres, to speak with people, to understand their lived experiences. And within this approach, we've also targeted some specific groups who are typically more marginalised or who we hear less from, who are perhaps, as discussed last week, a little bit more difficult to engage. And so today I'll be talking about our engagement with young people and also the LGBTQ+ community as well. Okay, so we have 4 main approaches to engaging with young people. So we had a puppetry project where we worked with young people with special educational needs and disabilities to explore life in Islington and the hopes of the future using puppetry. Second, we had self-facilitated workshops across 14 schools and 1 targeted youth service. So we had almost 700 young people take part in those, and those were self-facilitated workshops in schools. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a second. We also worked with an anthropologist from Cambridge through the CAPE project, and she basically ran a series of lunchtime clubs teaching anthropological research skills to primary school children in deprived schools in the borough, and they then used those techniques to articulate their views of the world around them. So, for example, kind of interviewing with objects, proxemic mapping, this notion of voicing for the other. So some really, really interesting creative methods that she used. And we also ran a borough-wide creative competition for under 18s in the borough to encourage submissions. So I'm just going to focus a bit more on the puppetry and the workshops today, but also very happy to talk about the anthropology and the creative competition offline, or to chat more if people are interested in those particular areas. So in terms of how we worked with schools, so I think our approach was that we wanted to, again, go to where young people are, and schools are a really obvious way to find lots of young people. So what we kind of first did was we liaised with head teachers of local schools to understand which age groups they thought could liaise with the topic. And I think a learning for me was that initially I thought, oh, it would just be kind of, you know, year 7, year 8 and above will be able to engage with this topic. But actually the head teachers were very, very affirming that younger children can engage with this, and they have the capacity and creativity to engage with this. And so we engaged with children from year 3 and up. And that's a piece of learning which probably one of the biggest takeaways for me, which is to have more trust in younger people's abilities, and especially primary age school children as well, to kind of have great insights and great ideas, and to have brilliant observations about the world around them. So we first liaised with the head teachers, and then we kind of co-developed questions and a draft structure with them to ensure that it was age appropriate, and we wanted to also ensure that the young people were both facilitators and as well as being participants of the engagements. We wanted young people to be developing the skills to be facilitating their own conversations and to be really taking the lead on that. We then kind of tested a draft at a local primary school. We got feedback from teachers and from children as to how that worked, how the questions flowed, that kind of thing. And then we refined and tested further. And then we rolled this out in, as I said, 14 schools across the borough, primary, secondary, independent and SEND schools with a range of pupil premium and deprivation, as we really wanted to get a mix of schools to understand, to get the diversity of inequality in the borough, essentially. I think some of my key learnings from this, as I said, were to have a lot more trust in young people's abilities, especially primary age children, to have brilliant insights and ideas, and also the ability to facilitate discussions. So these are the questions here. So, for example, some of the questions were what can be done to make Islington a fair and more equal place. So trusting in young people's abilities to have great responses to these questions, essentially. I think the second key learning is also to engage teachers early and get their support and use their expertise and co-develop that process with them. And finally, again, making life easier for ourselves to just go to the spaces where young people are. There's no point organising separate workshops, just go to schools, go to youth centres, etc. Go to where young people are hanging out. This is just a little example of what some of the things which young people came up with, some of their sort of policy suggestions. So, for example, things such as making changes to the education system, for example, more life skills lessons in schools and putting inclusion on the curriculum. So the final bit I'll focus on with young people is these puppetry workshops, which we ran with a local theatre company and a special education needs secondary school in the borough. And so our approach with this was that we wanted to do something a bit more creative, as we kind of I don't know. I think sometimes going in and doing a traditional survey isn't the best way to engage with young people, particularly if they have special educational needs, wanting to do something a bit more creative, give young people some new skills, and also give them the opportunity to maybe broaden their horizon, engage with puppets and arts, as well as being involved in our engagement process. So I'm just going to play a little clip, actually. I think it's the best way to demonstrate this. Hopefully it will work. A second. I knew this would happen. Okay, let me. Oh, here we go. Can everybody hear that?
Sorry, Imogen, I've got a feeling the volume won't work. You have to
Okay.
press the volume button before you upload the PowerPoint slide.
Okay. So what I'll do then is I'll just play you a little clip so you can see what it looks like, and then I'll just share the link in the chat so you can just look in your.
Perfect. And you've got 6 more minutes left as well.
Cool. So you can see just a little snippet there. I'll post the link in the chat afterwards about young people using puppets to voice their views and to voice ideas and what the work could look like. So I'm going to just skip now to our engagement with the LGBTQ+ community. So just a whistle-stop tour of why we work with this group. So Let's Talk Islington takes an intersectional approach to equality. So we understand that social factors intersect with economic circumstances to produce different outcomes for different groups. We have a significant dearth of data on LGBTQ+ community in Islington. So in the absence of a large-scale data collection, we wanted to do a bit more of a deep dive and work with a small cohort of people to meaningfully explore people's experiences of inequality. We also know that, as I mentioned, traditional research doesn't always involve mutual knowledge exchange or upskilling, and the researcher holds a lot of the power and control over the narrative and of how that person's story is told. And we wanted to basically really give, really kind of use this as an opportunity to increase community power. So we wanted to give people with lived experiences, to people sharing their stories with us, more control and ownership over their stories, and also provide an opportunity for upskilling. So it's not just a kind of one-way situation. It's a mutual exchange of knowledge and skills and power. And in turn, we hope that this would improve policy design by closing the gap between what we think, what we assume, and people's lived realities. So the way we did this is that we teamed up with London Metropolitan University to run a series of documentary filmmaking workshops for a small cohort of LGBTQ+ people in the borough. So we provided equipment, and they were taught documentary filmmaking techniques, which they then used to create their own films articulating their experiences of being queer in Islington. So this is all part of a community action research methodology called Video Voice, which is a visual research methodology and community advocacy tool, which puts cameras into community hands in order to document, reflect upon, and communicate salient issues. The process also emphasizes community participation, including in the design, analysis, and action on the results. So an example of this is that the co-researchers, so the queer people participating in the group, developed their own research questions and process instead of being directed by the team. So we didn't set, I suppose, an exam question. It was very much up for the co-researchers to think about their question in the broader context of being queer in Islington. The academics also ensured that there were ongoing discussions about power dynamics in the room between the researcher and the participants, so discussing that power, acknowledging it, make sure that it was known about in the room. And then finally, we also wanted to ensure that our evaluation is again, not the traditional approach of how many people turned up, let's fill in a form of did you enjoy it or not. We wanted to be focused on, again, community power. So thinking about, did the participants form social connections as a group after the workshops ended? Did they continue to use documentary filmmaking techniques, etc.? So did they receive proper upskilling? Is it sustainable? Did they form community, etc.? And these are just some nice pictures here of the group in action. So that was a really whistle-stop tour, and yeah, if anybody has any questions, please do so in the chat. And I think I'm 1 minute early, which is very exciting.
No, excellent. No, you finished a minute early, actually, Imogen, so thank you very much.
Right.
And we do have a Q&A right at the end, so
Okay.
you can post your chat or questions or save them for later. But thanks, Imogen, and you've got some really kind of rich approaches taking place in Islington. So I'll be really interested to learn what kind of inspired this creative turn, what's driving this creativity from your borough. Without any more ado, if we can ask George and Toby, are you able to upload your PowerPoint slide?
Yeah, it should be coming up.
So yeah, fabulous. So if you don't mind introducing yourself and your authority, thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is George Despotidis. I work for Waltham Forest Council, and more specifically, I'm a lead service designer within our strategy and design team. And today with my colleague Toby, we will be talking you through our journey of developing our EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Making a Living strategy. So I'll hand over to Toby to make a start.
Thank you. Thanks, George. Thanks, Darren. Yes, I'm Toby Stone. I'm Policy Officer here at Waltham Forest Council. Been working for more than a year, almost a year and a half with George on EDI Making a Living programme. And the strategy, I'm pleased to say, has just gone through our cabinet this July as of last week. So all of this work has now kind of been approved, and there's been that end note of the strategy. But to start off, so as I mentioned, it's a culmination of more than a year's work, and it started with us producing something that we called the State of the Borough report. So the State of the Borough set out the inequalities in kind of terms of quantitative data that exist within the borough. So every inequality that residents face that we could find data for is within that report. So it was a huge undertaking, ended up being a 70-page document. And it's framed around the kind of 5 themes of a person's life course. So having a good start in life, living a healthy life, making a living, living in equal communities, and exercising power and influence. So when we reviewed all of that data, it became quite clear that if we wanted the end result to be an EDI strategy, it would simply be impossible to have a good kind of a good representation of that data if we try to focus it all on all of the themes. So we focused down on the one theme and we chose making a living. So that's why our program is the EDI Making a Living program. So what does making a living mean? Well, it's more than just jobs. It's about access to employment, training and skills. It's about education. It's about the wider benefits and pension systems that enable people to live and live well and to make ends meet. And it's about the impacts of other responsibilities, childcare, caring responsibilities, and so much else that all inputs into someone's ability to make a living. Now, obviously, people's ability to make a living isn't equal. And the State of the Borough showed this, but what it didn't do was kind of underlay that lived experience underneath that. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So I'll just briefly give a kind of timeline of the programme before I pass over to George to speak through specifically in terms of what we did in terms of participation and community engagement. So as I mentioned, we started off with the State of the Borough report all the way back in June last year, and we took stock and realised that the scale of structural inequalities will only really be told when we overlay the lived experience of residents. So we set about trying to work out a process of hearing from residents, and we called this community conversations. So originally, a lesson learned, which isn't on this slide, is we originally procured a organisation which we wanted to kind of do all of the engagement and then develop a summit event and then produce a strategy. We went down that route because we thought it would be better to have kind of continuity along that journey. But what we actually found was that there wasn't we couldn't find an organisation out there that actually had the skill and the expertise to do all of this at each stage. So we went back to the drawing board and we designed these community conversations. So George will talk through these in far more detail. But essentially, it was a kind of deep dive listening engagement, and we used a multi-method process. So we used ethnographic research, we used workshops which VCS organisations were paid and led with key target groups. We used kind of more traditional methods of digital research, kind of face-to-face engagement as well. So in total, 550 residents, 400 hours of engagement made up those community conversations. So all of this was based on the theme of making a living. And at the turn of the year, we analysed the data from the community conversations. So there were almost 100 separate and distinct challenges that were raised by residents throughout that process. And they also told us of over 70 solutions that they had to the issues of making a living in the borough. We condensed this down into 4 themes. So it was clear that there were kind of four key themes that came out of that. So building inclusive workplaces was one, developing good quality jobs for everyone, learning advice and skills was a kind of third distinct area, and then finally a wider area of creating a caring and fair system. So we brought the residents and the community group representatives who had delivered the community conversations, we brought them together in a kind of citizens assembly style way at an EDI summit in March this year. So we had 32 come together over 3 days to analyse the evidence of the state of the borough, the lived experience in the community conversations, and some kind of policy interventions that we'd gathered as well, cases of best practice elsewhere. And over the course of 3 days, we got that group together to collectively co-design the recommendations for action. And just where we're at now, so obviously, as I mentioned, the EDI strategy went to July Cabinet. That strategy contains the 15 recommendations which came out of that summit event, unabridged from residents and community groups. So we've taken exactly on board, and that's what we're committing to deliver. So just on the next slide, as I mentioned, the community conversations was based around kind of underlaying that lived experience. So from the state of the borough, we found that there were kind of 6 key groups that we'd identified as having particular facing particular structural inequalities around making a living. So these were Black men, disabled people, migrants, including refugees and asylum seekers, older residents, South Asian women, and young people. So a lot of our community conversations, not all of it, but a lot of it was focused on these 6 key target groups and working with VCS groups that specifically support these groups. As well as that, a mixture of our own kind of historic engagement with groups and also data from the state of the borough or even gaps in the data, as is the case with the LGBTQIA+ community, showed that there was lots more research to be done on many other groups that weren't in those key target groups. So in terms of the ethnographic research, in terms of intersecting inequalities, these groups came in quite strongly there. Also, the majority of these groups we also ran workshops with because we wanted to capture their lived experience as well. But I think it's important to kind of show what groups we were targeting in this kind of more specialised way for the community conversations before we brought it more holistically to the summit. So onto the next slide, I think George is going to speak through in more detail what the community conversations were.
Great, thank you very much, Toby. So yeah, I think this slide basically shows the 3, 4, 5 key strands of engagement and how we structured kind of our thinking when we were trying to design the engagement throughout those kind of different phases. So the first one, which was one of the biggest one and the one that we were very keen to test as well, because it was a new way of working with our VCS and community groups, was to conduct what we call community-led targeted engagement. So basically, this is where we work with our local community, voluntary and community sector, and ask them to run workshops and sessions with the clients they work with. So we have tried to match the target groups with those kind of VCS partners in order for us to be able to reach out and engage with those individuals. The important thing here, I think, is apart from incentivizing, of course, the time of the VCS sector, and of course using their kind of links with the community, is acknowledging that many times residents do not trust the council. And speaking with the council, they have already built relationships with community groups and community leaders that they have helped them throughout their lives, so they're more open and more honest to the conversation they're going to have. And in addition, the topic that we were going to discuss was a very sensitive one. So, it's not a topic about your street and like bin collection. It's something very personal, and the inequalities and maybe racism and other discrimination you have faced throughout your life. So we want to make sure that this people feel as comfortable as possible discussing that kind of issue. In order to support the VCS, we commissioned a local group which was providing facilitation support. We wanted to build the capacity of the local VCS sector in order to, acquire the skills and the experience engaging with people in that kind of research type of approach. Some groups seem to be more experienced in that kind of space of facilitating this kind of workshops. Some didn't, so the support was very valuable in some of those cases. But also we wanted a kind of independent view of someone within the room, because we want to make sure it's the participants' views that will be coming across and not the organization's kind of views. In addition, what we did, we actually, as a council, we were there at the workshops just taking notes. So we were just helping the conversation, but just taking notes. And then we played back the notes to the community groups to make sure they kind of agree and feel that this is actually representing what was discussed at the meeting. And then, as this box states, we didn't actually end up using that, but as a plan B, we also were planning to commission an organization to help us with recruiting people if that was needed. But we were kind of very lucky. Our community groups were able to reach out to the people we wanted. The other strand, which is another one very interesting and one that was hadn't been used by Waltham Forest before, was the kind of ethnographic research approach. And that links very much with what you mentioned, Darren, and what Toby mentioned before about the intersectionality. The whole area of equality, diversity, and inclusion, and specifically making a living, but overall is a very complex kind of social issue. And the barriers people are facing is, we didn't want to take basically, as the previous slide, so just quickly going back, basically this one, want to take a person's life approach. We didn't want to focus on a specific, protected characteristics like sex or age or any of those. We want to look at the whole thing holistically. So that meant that the whole ethnographic approach was a very much valuable approach to understand all this kind of intersectionality and the problems people are facing throughout their lives. So this is where we commission an ethnographic research organization to conduct that. The next one was the face-to-face outreach. So we wanted to go out on the street, basically a street-based engagement, speak to people. Definitely, this wasn't a very much in-depth conversation as the workshops or the ethnographic research was. It was more like 3 kind of high-level questions, grabbing people on the street. Lessons learned, it wasn't that valuable for the specific topic, because in our case, we wanted to understand, it wasn't a case, have you faced like discrimination, or is it difficult for you to find, a job or stay in a job or things like that. It was more understanding the reason behind that. So that kind of street-based engagement, it was a bit, it wasn't bringing the quality basically of the insight that we were looking for. However, it turned out to be very good in engaging young people, because we had an organization which is basically run by young people, which is called Street Base, and they were really good at engaging young people. So that like 90% of the people that we were able to engage through the face-to-face Street Base were young people. They were going to places where young people knew, they hang out, so they were able to engage with them in a much more meaningfully than we would.
Sorry to interrupt, George. You've just got a few more minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. The last two very quickly to whiz through was the mass outreach. So basically going out to kind of big events that's running across the council and just having a presence there, having conversations with people on the spot again. And then last one, the targeted digital outreach. Again, initially we used a platform called Commonplace Lessons Learned. It didn't quite work, not because of the platform, but it was a tricky topic to discuss kind of online and ask, an open-ended question about your experience around like making a living and discrimination. It seemed more of a topic that it would be easier to discuss in person. Although we then used more of a traditional survey approach, and it seemed to have to worked well. Lastly, two things to mention in this slide: quality assurance. We work with, and I think that's very important, with local councils, bringing independent organizations on board. So we work with the Democratic Society to provide this kind of quality assurance and friendly challenge across the engagement piece. And of course, we were monitoring our engagement, and we were ready to kind of make any tweaks or put more resources into it if needed. So very quickly, just to say, throughout our community conversations, we were able to engage 550 people throughout over 400 hours of engagement. We held 20 those kind of VCS-led workshops, which I mentioned, 136 residents taking part, 13 ethnographic research case studies. The survey was completed by over 250 people, and 120 people engaged through those kind of mass engagement events. This one, just very quickly to say that alongside this engagement, we also gave VCS groups a share of 10K to kind of pilot solutions. So this, the reason we want to kind of mention that, I just want to say that sometimes by doing things, so learning from that, you can actually learn the same way that you can learn from engagement. So one of the pilot projects, for example, was increasing digital skills. So there was a disability resource center, an organization in Waltham Forest, that they kind of use the funding to buy tablets and train people in using tablets. So lessons learned from that pilot is also part of kind of our engagement, and also of course our focus to kind of use funding to support local VCS organizations to trial things and do things, because in the long term there will be our partners in implementing solutions. And yeah, that was me, and I'll hand over back to Toby.
Yeah, so I'll just do this very quickly. So just say, after all of that community conversations, after the development fund, we then had the EDI Making a Living Summit, which brought together both the information from that and also the people that had been part of those workshops, and kind of brought those workshops to life as well. So in terms of the kind of representation, it was over-representative of certain groups compared to the borough demographics, so different from a kind of traditional citizens assembly model, but we felt that that was necessary based on the topic of conversation that we were asking people to discuss. Did it work? It did. So I think thanks to a lot of probably hard work from ourselves and also the Democratic Society, we did manage to make the summit a success. The recommendations were really good. They were really balanced. It wasn't kind of dominated by one group, although on the first day there was definite kind of grumblings. I think someone described it as the first day people came in with an angry emoji, and on the third day people were dancing in the street and during the lunch break. So it was a really kind of collective effort to get to those recommendations. Anyone that's done a citizens assembly style project, I'm sure, will have similar experiences. And yeah, I think that's, conscious of time, so I think that's pretty much the end of our presentation. I think we just had some pictures on the last slide to show you what the summit looked like.
Perfect. No, thank you, George, and thank you, Toby, for a great presentation, and Imogen as well. So two very, very good examples really of how you can use creativity, use partnerships in order to better engage marginalised residents. And I'm pleased, George, that you dealt with the elephant in the room, which is the lack of trust in local authorities as well. But in terms of next steps, I'm going to skip the interactive board because I'm conscious we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I know that there's a lot of questions occurring in the chat. And so if we jump over into the Q&A, I think we'll probably use our time more efficiently in that way. So does anybody want to kind of pose a question to Imogen, George, or myself based on the presentations? Or again, just commentary on what you're doing? Please kind of raise your hands or shout out or mute. So George.
Sorry, it was just responding to two questions that I see in the chat. One is about whether we are able to share the initial action plan. Toby, if I'm not mistaken, that has gone through cabinet, so we can share that. And the other question from Hannah about the methodology for capturing the learnings from the pilot group, so the pilot kind of projects that we run. So we initially we were planning to have a more kind of robust and systematic way of capturing that, like a methodology, as you say, but the groups that we were working with were very small, and their capacity and resource was so squeezed that we didn't want to kind of force them into a specific kind of structure. So we kind of worked with them, very much hand holding in what's the best way for them to give us the feedback from those groups. So some were more, let's say, creative, even like videos from people and the whole participation and the project. Others were just a Word document with, lessons learned. So I think the approach initially, we wanted to have a more kind of robust and systematic way, but our communities team, which is the team that actually has those relationships with the VCS, and actually it's really helpful to have such team within the council, told us this is not the best way to engage with those specific groups. Some of them mostly run just by volunteers, so it would have been difficult for them.
Thank you, George. There's a question from Martin. Is it Martin King?
Hi, sorry, yes, thank you very much for those talks. I suppose one of the things I was interested in was how you were evaluating how inclusive those recruitment processes were. And I suppose I was particularly interested in how we try to capture who might be missing when we're recruiting people, because I suppose if you're recruiting through certain community groups, one of the things that we've found is that that there will be within those groups that they work with, there will be people that they can't reach as well, and we've been discussing that with them. And with things like citizen assemblies, there's this idea of good enough participation. So as long as you can hit certain kinds of targets in terms of to demonstrate representativeness, but it's always very difficult to work out who's turning down invitations, who and how that might be impacting the quality of the process. So I'd be really interested in your evaluation of that work, and
could I ask Imogen to respond? I call that the minority within the minority.
So to your first question about recruitment, yeah, I guess it's a challenge that is you can just, I suppose the approach to that is to just, from my perspective, is to just try as hard as possible to have as widespread a recruitment process as possible. So if I take the example of the LGBTQ plus Blue Voice project, I sort of just got in touch with about 25 different LGBTQ groups across London, including groups which only existed like on Facebook, and asked them to share the pitch with their groups and to get back to me, as well as going through the more, I suppose, more like service-oriented groups as well, working with people in a particular service. And so, yes, I suppose my approach is just to try and go as widespread as possible, and just to reach people, and through that, to try and reach people who wouldn't typically be engaged because they're not a regular service user. They're in a Facebook group, or they're in a social network, that kind of thing. And then was the second question about evaluation? I don't know if that was more directed towards George, I think.
Did you want to respond to either of those questions, George?
Oh, sorry. I think the evaluation, I covered that before. I think with The representation, Toby, feel free to kind of jump in, because I know, throughout
Yeah.
the recruitment, you were kind of looking at that kind of daily and like, is it going up? Are we, increasing the numbers in that group?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in on that. So in terms of recruitment, I think it wasn't a perfect process. I think we had time limitation on terms of the recruitment. So that was actually managed by DemSoc, our partners who were delivering the summit. But yeah, so we went out through the VCS groups who had delivered the workshops. We also invited people who had kind of proactively messaged us about the summit because we'd put comms out there. But yeah, there were definitely groups that we struggled to get. So we really struggled on young people. We had a kind of significant gender imbalance, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was kind of representative of our key target groups. But I think it was a new approach to a citizens assembly type model for both us and DemSoc, in the sense that we were actually only recruiting from a relatively select pool of people. I think there were pros and cons to that. I think it meant that people came into the first day quite informed, and people were really invested. That every day, it would be a struggle to get people to leave, and there'd be multiple conversations of remember this point, don't forget this point, and then people would follow up with emails afterwards. I think the downside was that maybe we lost some of the voices in the room, because we did get those people that kind of are community champions anyway. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but it was definitely a difficult lesson. I'm not sure whether we'd necessarily got it right.
Thank you, George. And another question from Katie. You had your hand raised, you put it down. So this is your space if you want to come back. Followed by Emmy, and then over to Beth, please.
Thank you. First of all, huge thanks for organising these workshops. They have been tremendously helpful. And of course, I've got a delivery next door. Now the dog is barking, so apologies for that.
Yes.
My question, and I'm not suggesting for 1 second there is an easy answer, is we are hearing a lot around community power, active neighbourhood democracy, those type of spaces, type conversations. And I suppose my provocation to the room is, how do we stop that from becoming an industry? How do we stop that from becoming the new shiny thing, in the way that I'm seeing in Greater Manchester, especially all the codes, the co-designs, the co-productions. It's a new sexy thing, and at some point that bubble will burst. So how do we prevent that from happening?
That's an interesting question. I don't know, beyond the presenters, does anybody want to respond to that point?
I mean, I'll jump in.
Please.
I think how you stop it becoming an industry is you make sure it actually changes you as an organisation. And that was I had a few questions, but that was one of mine, was how do we ensure that this changes us as institutions? How does it start to impact culture and behaviour and governance and decision making? And how do we, one of the, I'm thinking about sort of the operating model side of things. Is, we're looking in Southwark at developing a borough plan, and my role in strategy and change is thinking about how we, in alignment, evolve an operating model over time that talks to the borough plan work we're doing, so that we can start to embed the learning and change. And also then thinking about how we prioritise investment, so that we're not asking residents to then participate in everything, but we're understanding where the maximum impact is, understanding how much capacity and appetite there is in the borough to contribute, and then directing that where it's generating most impact for residents. So there is a conversation about how do residents define impact, and what do they think is valuable and important, but then using that to develop prioritisation, so that we're not just sort of scattergun doing it everywhere. Because the reality, well, I can only speak for us, we don't have the budget to do it in everything. We can't do it for every scrap of what we do as a council. But I do think the tie to how does it change us, and also how is it a continuous conversation? Because if it's a periodic exercise, then obviously it's not a relationship. Or at least it's not the kind of relationship that residents might expect. So that for me, that's the insulating factor, is how are we building in metrics to demonstrate that these conversations are then changing and shaping the institution, not just particular services or particular comms approaches, because then you've got assurance that it's not just good stuff, good learning, good listening, but it's making us then do the hard work of adapting. But that's
well, no, thank you, Beth and Katie, for that question and response. And I think you gave us a really good steer out to reach next week's workshop, which is all about, again, how do we stretch ourselves? What learning and capacity building do we need to do in order to do good quality engagement with kind of challenging or hard to reach residents or marginalised residents? So we'll definitely pick up on this theme next week, and we'll probably have a much more in-depth discussion about it. If we can just jump to, is it Emmy? You had a question, you've got your hand.
I think Beth covered it really well, actually. We've been the big elephant in the room for me is budget and cost, but also how we spend that. Are we thinking about sustainability of these approaches? How can, you know, we do a big piece of work and engagement, how are the relationships sustained, and also how does it contribute to systemic change within how we work and within what we do? And I'm glad that you said that, you know, that'd be something we'll come back to, because I think kind of how we use budget responsibly to create systemic change and sustainable relationships is, for me, a whole workshop that I'd be really interested in hearing people's thoughts. So I'm really thanks to Beth kind of opening the door to that one too.
Excellent. And so thank you for those questions. And if I can I guess go back to the presenters and just finally ask, what's the legacy of your piece of work? Were they both one-off exercises, or is it embedded within the system? Do you plan to develop the models you've used going forward? So if I go to Imogen first, sorry.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. And I suppose the results of that we wait to see, because we are still, because we're still sort of finishing everything up. And so I can't, you know, I think we would have to look back in a year's time and see has that culture been embedded across the organisation. But we definitely do plan. I think one of the big learnings for us from this whole piece of engagement has been that we have to do engagement differently, and doing engagement creatively and doing it in a way which is participatory led and going to community spaces. That has to be the model for all future engagement and participation, and that's effective, and that gets people excited, and that gets people invested in the process, and also provides upskilling opportunities as well. So the short answer is yes, and I wait to see.
We'll come back to you in a year's time. Thank you.
Yeah,
and going to Toby and George now.
Yeah, so from our side, I think there's a few things that are going to continue. So in terms of the participants of the summit, so we're continuing to engage with them. We engage with them on the strategy writing and the action plan to make sure that their views were collected for the delivery plan moving forwards in the next few months. Same again, and we're hoping to have kind of citizens panel style. So the ones that want to continue engaging can kind of continue to review our work in this process. In terms of the actual engagement techniques that we used, our vaccine hesitancy program has basically copied and pasted our VCS workshop approach, as has our 15-minute neighbourhoods work that we're doing as well, which is, I think, going to be quite central to the council over the next couple of years. So there's definitely some kind of lessons learned for the council that are taking on board based on our approach that we've shared.
Yeah, no, that's really good, fantastic, and thank you all for your presentations today. Before I guess we turn off or tune off, Noel, is there any kind of final reflections on your part you want to share?
Only to say, I think, yeah, the questions and the presentations are really good platform for next week's event, which is what are the skills that we need as staff to kind of to do this, to tackle the challenges that we discussed, and to get closer to the kinds of experiences that that Waltham Forest and Islington shared. So I think, yeah, kind of we're kind of focusing more and more into the different things that we need as councils to get this stuff working.
Thank you, Noel. And just from my side as well, I'm very interested in exploring more that idea of the industry, potentially what can develop around co-production and this engagement work we're all doing. with residents, and also the ethnographic stroke anthropological work as well. As kind of policymakers, you translate that work into evidence, what you can then present to elected members, people who are normally more used to dealing with statistics as opposed to emotions and understanding. So I'll be really interested how that conversion and set of skills we need to do that as well. So, well, on that point, I would say goodbye to you all, really. Big thank you for joining us today. And just remember to register for next week, and see you next week. And have a good week.